The morning began before the city woke. Manhattan still wore its gray-blue hush, the kind that comes just before sunrise. In the highest penthouse of the Reed Tower, the hum of a coffee machine was the only sound cutting through the silence. Alexander Reed stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, one hand in the pocket of his tailored slacks, the other holding a cup that had long gone cold. From this height, even the Hudson seemed small. Down below, the lights of taxis flickered like restless fireflies. Up here, everything was still too still. His reflection stared back at him from the glass-sharp jawline, silver cufflinks, eyes that people called calculating. But what they didn't see, what no one ever did, was the exhaustion just behind that polished surface. On the desk behind him, a dozen screens glowed in shades of blue. Numbers danced, markets shifted, decisions waited. At 35, Alexander was the mind behind Reed Dynamics, a global tech empire built from precision, discipline, and an iron will. People said he didn't sleep, that he didn't feel, that the air around him was as cold as the data he lived by. He had heard the whispers, the glacier, a nickname that once made him smirk. Now, it just stayed, like frost that never quite melted. The intercom beeped softly. "Mr. Reed, the Singapore call is ready," said a voice, calm, efficient, robotic. He didn't even have to ask who it was. Every voice around him sounded the same these days. "Delay it 15 minutes, he replied, setting down the cup. "I want the merger report first." "Yes, sir?" He turned toward his desk, where the walls of glass framed his empire. Every inch of this office was perfection. Italian leather, steel, silence. Yet, somehow, it always felt like a museum, beautiful, lifeless, echoing with the footsteps of people who came and went but never stayed. He tapped the edge of a photo frame that sat alone on the corner of his desk. It was old 10 years, maybe more. Two young men, brothers, standing beside their father in front of a small electronics shop in Boston. The smile on his father's face looked larger than the store itself. Alexander's lips pressed together. He turned the frame face down. Perfection had its price, and he had paid every cent. The elevator chimed in the distance, a soft metallic sound, followed by hurried footsteps. His assistant, Claire, appeared in the doorway, holding a sleek tablet. "Good morning, sir. The audit team from New York is arriving this afternoon. They'll start with financials for the merger." Alexander didn't look up. "Names Carter, Emily, senior financial auditor. She'll be working directly with you for the next 2 weeks." He gave a short nod. "Make sure she understands the confidentiality terms. No leaks. Already signed, sir." Claire hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, then thought better of it. "Also, the board meeting's been moved to Friday." He waved a hand dismissively. "Fine." When she left, the silence settled again, thick and familiar. He glanced at the clock. 7:42 a.m. Another day, another mountain of decisions. But something about that name, Emily Carter, lingered. Not because he cared who worked under him, but because he knew how these audits went: endless numbers, careful questions, subtle doubts. And he had little patience for people who thought they could read him through spreadsheets. He sat down, the leather chair sighing under his weight, and began typing. Emails, directives, approvals, the rhythm of control, the pulse he trusted more than his own heartbeat. By mid-morning, the sun had risen high enough to paint the room in gold, but the light didn't reach him. He'd chosen this side of the building for a reason, the one where the glare stayed soft, never intrusive. His phone buzzed once. A message from his sister. "Grace, haven't seen you in months. You promised dinner. Don't make me show up at your office again." He allowed himself a small, tired smile. Grace was the only person who dared to tease him. He typed back quickly. "Next week, I'll make time." Then, before he could stop himself, he deleted the message. Work came first. It always did. By noon, the office had come alive with movement, the quiet kind. assistants whispering through Bluetooth headsets, executives rushing between meetings, screens flashing with projections. Through the glass wall, Alexander could see his team moving like a well-trained machine, efficient, predictable, just the way he liked it. Until the elevator chimed again, he barely looked up at first, but then a new one broke the pattern. Bright, confident, with a rhythm that didn't match the cold air of this floor. "Mr. Reed Emily Carter, from the audit division. I was told to report to you." He turned his head, just slightly. A woman stood at the doorway, holding a folder close to her chest. Her posture was straight, but not stiff, her tone respectful, but not afraid. Most people who entered this room carried the weight of his reputation on their shoulders. She didn't seem to. Alexander blinked once, measuring her in silence. Then his voice returned to its usual calm. "You're early." "Habit," she said. "I like to understand a place before I start pulling it apart." Something flickered across his expression, something like surprise, though it vanished before it could form. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Then sit. Let's see what you think needs pulling apart." As she stepped forward, the faint scent of rain clung to her coat. Manhattan had been wet that morning. She must have walked instead of taking a car. He noticed the way she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear before setting down the folder, small, precise, focused. He shouldn't have noticed, but he did. For the next hour, the room filled with the sound of papers turning and keys clicking. Emily asked direct questions about data discrepancies, cross-department transactions, and missing timestamps. Sharp, professional, but beneath the numbers. Alexander sensed something else, an energy that didn't belong to this sterile floor, a pulse that made the air shift, just slightly warmer. When the meeting ended, she closed her laptop, stood up, and said, "I'll send the first report by evening." He nodded, already turning back to his screen. "Be thorough. I don't tolerate mistakes." Her reply came without hesitation. "Neither do I." When the door clicked shut behind her, Alexander sat still for a long moment. Outside, the rain had stopped. A thin beam of sunlight slipped through the clouds, landing across his desk, right where the old photo frame lay face down. He reached for it slowly, hesitated, then turned it upright again. For reasons he couldn't explain, the room didn't feel as cold anymore. And though he would never admit it, not yet, something inside him had shifted, just enough to let the light in. The next morning, Manhattan woke under a curtain of soft mist. Traffic lights blinked red and gold through the fog, and the hum of the city rose like a slow heartbeat. Emily Carter held her coffee cup with both hands as she crossed the street toward the tall glass building of Reed Dynamics. Her first full day, her first time standing this close to power. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of steel and rain. People moved quickly, polished shoes clicking against marble floors. Emily's heels echoed among them, a little faster, a little louder than she meant. Her heart, though steady, beat hard. She wasn't afraid, just alert, like a bird flying into unfamiliar air. When the elevator doors closed, she caught her reflection in the brushed metal, hair tied neatly, blazer pressed, eyes bright. Beneath the neatness, a spark of curiosity, almost defiance, glimmered. She whispered to herself, "Don't freeze. Just do what you do best. Numbers don't scare you." At the 35th floor, the air changed, colder, quieter. The hum of conversation died into professional silence. The walls were glass, the carpet gray, the world outside a blur of skyline. She followed the sound of distant voices until she reached his office. The glacier's domain. Claire, the assistant, looked up from her desk. "He's expecting you? Go right in." Emily nodded, took a breath, and stepped inside. Alexander Reed was already there, standing beside the window again. The city stretched behind him like a painted backdrop. He didn't turn right away when she entered, and for a moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. But then his voice came calm, measured, deep. "You're early again. I like to start before the room fills with noise," she said. He glanced over his shoulder, studying her for half a second longer than politeness required. "Noise doesn't bother me. Mistakes do." "Then we're safe," she replied, placing her folder on the desk. Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or surprise. It vanished too quickly to tell. He moved closer, his presence quiet but heavy, like gravity. "Let's begin." They worked for hours, the table between them filled with open files and the soft tapping of keys. Emily asked questions no one else dared to ask, tracing connections in the merger documents others had overlooked. She didn't hesitate, didn't apologize for her precision. At one point, she caught him watching her hands as she flipped through the papers, calm, quick, deliberate. "You've read all this already?" he asked. "Twice," she said. "You learn a lot when you listen to what numbers try not to say." He paused. "And what are they saying now? That someone's hiding a pattern." She answered softly. "It's small, but it's there." He leaned forward slightly, his interest caught. "Show me." Emily pointed to the chart. "Here, see the expense drift across quarters. It doesn't match the stated acquisitions. Someone's masking a transfer under project budgets." The room fell still. Only the rain against the glass broke the quiet. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Who else knows?" "No one. Yet," she said. "But they will, once I finish tracing it." He looked at her again. Really looked this time. She wasn't intimidated. Not by him, not by his reputation, and that unsettled him more than any threat could. The meeting ended late in the afternoon. She gathered her notes, tucking them into her bag. He stood near the window again, one hand on his chin, eyes far away. "Ms. Carter," he said without turning. "Yes." He hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "Most people avoid telling me what I don't want to hear." She smiled faintly. "That sounds lonely?" He didn't answer. She didn't expect him to. As she reached for the door, he added, "Send me your findings before 8. "I will," she said. Then, almost playfully, "Don't stay up too late reading them." This time, he did turn just enough for her to catch the edge of a half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. Outside, the office lights had dimmed. The sky was a wash of violet and silver. Emily paused by the elevator, exhaling the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She could still feel the weight of his gaze, the cool control that seemed to surround him. And yet, beneath it, she'd sensed something else, something faint but alive. In the lobby, she stopped by the glass doors before stepping out into the rain. Her phone buzzed a message from her friend. "Leah. How's your first day with the Ice King?" Emily smiled, typing back quickly. "Colder than I thought, but the cracks are there." The cab ride home blurred into the rhythm of raindrops. She leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights smear into streaks of gold. For all his distance, Alexander Reed didn't feel unreachable. He felt guarded, as if life had taught him to build walls high enough to touch the clouds. And maybe, just maybe, she was the first person in a long time who wasn't afraid to knock. That night, long after she'd fallen asleep, Alexander was still awake in his penthouse. Her words replayed in his mind like a song he couldn't stop hearing. That sounds lonely. He had brushed it off at the time, but now, as he stood again by the window, city lights flickering against the glass, the silence of his world pressed closer. He poured himself another glass of water, then stopped midway, catching his own reflection in the window. For the first time in years, he didn't like what he saw. Outside, the mist was lifting. Somewhere below, taxis honked, and life kept moving. He set the glass down, turned off the lights, and let the room fall into shadow. But even in the dark, something had changed. A thought lingered unwelcome, yet undeniable. He'd spent years mastering control, perfecting distance. And yet, in the space of one afternoon, one woman had made the ice shift. Just slightly, just enough to let a little light in. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the city brushed clean. The sky a pale stretch of silver above Manhattan. Inside read dynamics. The world moved like clockwork, screens lighting, heels clicking, words exchanged only when necessary. But behind the closed glass doors of the 35th floor, something was shifting quietly, something that didn't fit the rhythm of the building. Emily sat at the long conference table, laptop open, surrounded by piles of data files. The soft hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Across from her, Alexander stood with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, one hand resting on the edge of the table, the other holding a pen he wasn't really using. He had been watching her work for almost an hour now, quietly, attentively, as if studying an unfamiliar language. Numbers flickered across her screen, columns of transactions, codes, transfers. Her eyes moved quickly, tracing paths, connecting dots no one else had noticed. She didn't look intimidated, not even under the weight of his presence. Her focus was unbroken, her mind sharp. Every few minutes she'd jot something down. The soft scratch of her pen, the only sound between them. "Here," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. She turned the screen toward him. "This entry, it doesn't match the corresponding statement. It's small, but deliberate." He stepped closer, scanning the numbers, his brow furrowed. "That's impossible. These accounts were reviewed by two separate teams." "Then both missed it," she replied simply. "Or both were told not to look." He looked up at her then, his gaze steady, unreadable. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," she said calmly. "It's math." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them tightened, humming with tension neither of them fully understood. Alexander straightened, walking toward the window. The city stretched beneath him, sharp and glinting. Everything he had built balanced on trust, precision, control. The idea that someone could be deceiving him within his own walls struck deeper than he expected. He turned back, his voice low. "If you're wrong, this could destroy reputations, careers." Emily didn't flinch. "And if I'm right, it means someone's already trying to destroy yours." Silence again. Except this time, it wasn't cold. It was charged, like the air before a storm. He moved closer, slow, deliberate, until he was standing just across the table from her. "You're not afraid to challenge me, are you?" She met his eyes, her tone soft but unwavering. "Would you respect me if I were?" He exhaled, something close to a laugh escaping him, though it didn't quite reach his lips. "Respect," he said, half to himself. "That's a dangerous thing to offer around here." "Maybe," she said, "but it's the only thing worth earning." He watched her for a moment longer, before nodding once, sharply. "Fine. Find proof. I want every file cross-checked by end of week. I'll need full access," she said. "You'll have it." Their eyes held for a second too long before he turned away. But even after he left the room, Emily felt his presence lingering, like the echo of a thought she couldn't quite shake. That evening, she stayed long after most of the office had emptied. The building was quiet, the only light coming from the glow of her screen and the faint reflection of city lights outside. Her fingers moved over the keyboard, eyes scanning, mind piecing together fragments of hidden trails. When the elevator chimed behind her, she didn't need to look to know who it was. His footsteps were distinct, measured, certain, but somehow slower tonight. "You're still here," Alexander said, stepping into the room. "So are you," she replied, not lifting her gaze. "I thought the glacier left on time." He raised an eyebrow. "The glacier." She smiled faintly. "That's what they call you downstairs." You didn't know his lips curved, but not into a real smile. "I've heard worse." He walked closer, stopping beside her desk. The glow from the monitor lit half his face, the other half lost in shadow. "What have you found?" She turned the screen toward him again. "See this pattern, same vendor name, different IDs. It's hidden across departments, masked under consulting fees. The total exceeds $5 million. He leaned in, eyes narrowing as he followed her cursor. "How did you find this?" "I looked where the reports told me not to," she said. Sometimes silence leaves bigger footprints than sound. For a moment, he just stood there, the rhythm of his breath audible in the quiet room. "You realize," he said finally, "if this leaks before we verify it, the entire merger could collapse." "I know," she said. "That's why we won't leak it. We'll prove it." He studied her. Really studied her. The calm certainty, the steadiness of her tone, the way her hand didn't tremble as she scrolled through the data. She wasn't seeking approval, she was seeking truth. And that, he realized, was something he hadn't seen in a long time. When she looked up, their eyes met too close, too long. Something unspoken hung in the air, soft but electric. The sound of thunder rolled in the distance, faint but steady. Rain began to tap against the windows again. Emily looked back at her screen. "I'll keep going a little longer," she said. "You should get some rest." He didn't move. "Rest isn't in my job description." "Then maybe that's the problem," she murmured. He almost smiled again, then stopped himself. "Send me the files when you're done." She nodded. "Good night, Mr. Reed." He hesitated at the door. "Good night, Ms. Carter." The door clicked softly behind him, but neither of them truly left that room, not in thought. Hours later, Emily finally closed her laptop. The rain had become a steady whisper against the glass, and the city lights shimmered like distant fireflies. She stretched, rubbing her eyes, and caught her reflection in the dark window, tired but alive. There was something thrilling about it all. The risk, the defiance, the quiet war between truth and power, far above, in his penthouse. Alexander stood by the window again, his tie loosened, his mind far from contracts. He thought about the woman who'd looked him in the eye and dared to disagree, about the calm in her voice, the heat behind her logic. It unsettled him. It fascinated him. It made the silence around him feel less comfortable than before. Outside, lightning flared over the Hudson, cutting the sky in two. For a brief second, the entire city lit up bright, alive, unguarded, and somewhere deep inside him, the first spark caught. It was small, barely visible, but once fire meets ice, nothing stays the same for long. Night had settled over the city like a silk curtain. The skyline shimmered under 1,000 office lights. But inside, read dynamics. Most floors were dark. Only one remained awake, the 35th. The hum of computers was steady, the glow from the monitors soft against the glass walls. It was past midnight. Everyone else had gone home. Everyone except them. Emily rubbed her temples, blinking at the screen. Numbers had started to blur, and the last of her coffee had gone cold hours ago. Yet she stayed, unwilling to leave while the final pieces of the audit still waited to be confirmed. She glanced across the room. Alexander was still at his desk, sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, eyes fixed on the reports she'd sent earlier. The world outside was silent, but inside, there was tension in the air, unspoken, invisible, alive. It wasn't the kind of tension born from work anymore. It was something slower, warmer, something that made her pulse skip whenever he looked up. At 12:47 a.m., the power flickered once. The overhead lights dimmed, then returned softer, leaving the office bathed in a low amber glow. It felt almost intimate. Emily exhaled quietly, smiling to herself. "Even the building's tired," she murmured. Alexander looked up. "You should go home," he said. His voice was lower than usual, rougher somehow. "It's too late." She didn't move. "You should too." He leaned back, watching her. "You're not very good at following orders." "Neither are you," she replied without missing a beat. A pause followed. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, barely there, but real. Touché. For a few minutes, they worked in silence again, the soft clicking of keyboards filling the room. But the air between them had shifted. It was no longer the quiet of concentration. It was awareness. Emily stood, gathering the printed reports and walking over to his desk. "These are the last files. The discrepancies confirm what I found earlier. It's not just a mistake, it's intentional. He looked up as she handed him the stack. Their fingers brushed, barely, but it was enough. The contact sent something through both of them, small, electric, uninvited. She tried to pull her hand back, but his touch lingered a second longer than necessary. Intentional, he repeated, forcing his tone to stay neutral. Yes, she said softly. Someone wanted you to miss this. His gaze stayed on her face, not the papers. And you didn't. I don't like seeing good work go to waste. He stood slowly, the chair sliding back with a quiet scrape. Now they were standing closer than they ever had before. The glow from the window lit only half their faces, shadows softening the lines that usually made him look so untouchable. Emily, he said, her name quiet in the air, almost like a confession. Do you always dive this deep into what you do? Only when it matters. And this matters. Her eyes lifted to his, more than I expected. The silence stretched between them, long and fragile. Outside, the rain began again, pattering against the glass steady, delicate. It filled the space between their heartbeats. He took a small step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You know the rules here. I don't get involved with employees. She smiled faintly, though her breath caught. I've heard. And yet, he continued, eyes locked on hers. I can't seem to remember why the rule exists. For a moment, neither moved. The city lights flickered, thunder rolled far in the distance, and everything felt suspended like the world was holding its breath for them. Then, slowly, inevitably, he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was light, cautious, almost reverent. She didn't pull away. The air felt warmer, the sound of rain louder, her pulse louder still. Alexander, she whispered, unsure if it was a warning or a plea. He didn't answer. He just looked at her. Really looked at her as if seeing something he'd been afraid to face for years. The ice behind his eyes cracked, quiet but certain. And then it happened. The distance closed. The papers on the desk fluttered as he leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't planned. It was everything they'd both been holding back, control breaking, rules dissolving, time slowing. It was soft at first, then deeper, and somewhere in that moment, all the walls he had built around himself began to fall away. The glass office, the empire, the weight of perfection, all of it faded. There was only the warmth of her hands against his chest, and the realization that, for the first time in years, he was alive. When they finally pulled apart, the only sound was their breath uneven, quiet, real. Emily looked at him, her eyes wide but calm. That probably broke a few policies, she murmured. He almost laughed. A few? They stood there for a long time, the rain whispering against the windows, neither willing to move first. Then Alexander stepped back, running a hand through his hair. The coolness tried to return to his voice, but it faltered. We should pretend that didn't happen. She finished for him, her tone light, though her chest ached with something she couldn't name. He nodded, but his eyes said otherwise. She smiled gently. You're not very convincing when you lie. He didn't respond. Instead, he looked away, toward the city lights. Go home, Emily. She hesitated, then gathered her things quietly. When she reached the doorway, she stopped and looked back. He was still standing there, staring out at the skyline like he was seeing it for the first time. Good night, Mr. Reed, she said softly. He didn't turn, but his voice followed her. Good night. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft chime, leaving him alone with the echo of rain and the taste of something dangerously human. He exhaled, pressing a hand to his chest, as if the warmth might fade if he didn't hold it there. For years, he had lived untouched by feeling untouched by anyone. But tonight, everything had changed. The glacier had cracked, and though the world outside still glittered with its usual indifference, Inside that office inside him, a fire had begun. The day after the kiss, the office felt different. The same polished floors, the same endless hum of work, but every glance, every pause in conversation carried a quiet, invisible current between them. Neither spoke of what happened, neither dared to, and yet it lingered like a scent that refused to fade. By evening, most of the staff had left. The city lights were beginning to bloom across the skyline when Emily shut down her computer. She reached for her bag just as a low voice came from behind her. "Emily!" She turned. Alexander stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, that calm control wrapped tightly around him again. But there was something else in his eyes tonight, something softer. "You've been here since 7, he said. "You should eat." She smiled lightly. "You checking on my schedule now?" He hesitated, as though weighing his next words. "There's a place in Brooklyn," he said finally. "Small, quiet, the food's better than anything near here." Emily blinked. "Are you asking me to dinner, Mr. Reed?" His lips curved slightly. "Considerate. An off-record meeting." She held his gaze for a long moment, trying to read what wasn't being said. Then she nodded. "All right. Off the record." The drive to Brooklyn was silent at first. The city rushed by, outside the tinted windows, neon lights, wet pavement, people moving like threads of light in the night. Emily sat beside him, her reflection mingling with his in the glass. He kept his eyes on the road, but his hands were relaxed on the wheel. The tension she was used to seeing in him, nowhere to be found. The restaurant was tucked between 2 brick buildings on a narrow street lined with trees and string lights. No suits, no cameras, no staff whispers, just the smell of baked bread and soft jazz floating through the air. Alexander held the door for her. It was a small gesture, but it felt strangely intimate coming from him. The hostess led them to a table by the window. Candles flickered in glass jars, their glow catching the gold in Emily's hair. She looked around, visibly surprised. "This doesn't feel like your usual kind of place." "It isn't," he admitted. "That's why I like it." They ordered simply pasta, wine, something to share. For the first few minutes, conversation clung to safe territory work, the merger, the market. But then, somewhere between the first sip of wine and the second, the walls began to loosen. She told him about her college years, the side jobs she worked to afford textbooks, how she learned to navigate numbers like they were a second language. Her voice carried a rhythm, steady, alive. He found himself listening more closely than he intended to, not for what she said, but for the warmth in how she said it. When she laughed a full, honest sound, it startled him. He realized he hadn't heard real laughter around him in a long time. Most people around Alexander spoke with caution, careful to measure every word. But she just spoke, "You're staring." She teased lightly. He blinked, caught off guard. "Sorry. It's unusual. What is someone who laughs like that in this city?" She smiled. "Then you're not looking in the right places." He looked down at his glass, swirling the wine absently. "Maybe not." For a while, neither spoke. The jazz played softly in the background, the low murmur of other tables filling the air. Alexander's gaze drifted to the street outside, where rain had begun to fall again, thin and silvery under the lights. "You know," Emily said after a pause, "you don't have to be Mr. Reed all the time." He raised an eyebrow. "And who should I be instead?" "Just Alexander," she said simply. "The man who apparently eats pasta in Brooklyn and listens to jazz." He chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "That man doesn't exist." "Oh, I think he does," she said softly. "He just doesn't show up often." Something in him eased at her words. The part of him that had always stood apart observing, calculating, found itself wanting, just for once, to be seen, not as a CEO, not as the glacier, just as a man sitting across from a woman who made the world sound a little less mechanical. The food arrived, but neither seemed to care much for it. They ate slowly, conversation flowing in easy waves, stories about small things, quiet things. She told him about her mother's garden in Vermont, the smell of lilac in early spring. He told her about his father's workshop, how the sound of old tools still reminded him of beginnings. At one point, she reached across the table to taste his dessert, laughing when he raised an eyebrow in mock disapproval. "You don't share dessert." "Not usually," he said, "but I can make an exception." Her smile softened. "You're full of exceptions lately." He didn't deny it. Later, when the plates were cleared and the candles had burned low, they stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the scent of it, fresh, electric. They stood under the awning, the streetlight painting soft halos on the wet pavement. Emily pulled her coat tighter. "Thank you for dinner," she said quietly. "I can't remember the last time I didn't talk about work for 2 hours straight." He looked at her, his voice low. "Neither can I." For a moment, it felt like the city around them disappeared. Just the two of them, and the steady sound of raindrops sliding from the awning. "Emily," he said, almost as if testing how her name felt in his mouth. "Tonight wasn't a mistake." "I know," she replied, "but it's still dangerous." He nodded, eyes lingering on her. "Most worthwhile things are." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. The air between them was charged again, familiar now, but still dizzying. She took a slow step back, her smile small, bittersweet. "Good night, Alexander." He watched as she turned, walking down the quiet Brooklyn street, her reflection rippling in the puddles left by the rain. For a long moment, he stood there, hands in his pockets, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, something unplanned, uncontrollable, alive. When he finally got back into the car, he didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, eyes tracing the faint glow of the restaurant through the glass. For the first time, he didn't think about meetings, deadlines, or deals. He thought about her laugh, the way it made the world sound less lonely. And he realized without warning, without defense, that somewhere between the silence and the rain, he'd crossed a line. The kind of line you can't uncross once your heart starts to follow. The rain had followed them back from Brooklyn, tracing soft streaks against the windshield as the city slipped quietly into midnight. Emily sat beside him in the car, the faint hum of the engine blending with the sound of water on glass. Neither of them spoke, yet the silence wasn't empty. It was charged, full of the things they couldn't say. When the elevator doors opened to the penthouse, the world below seemed to vanish. The air smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Hudson shimmering under the moonlight, each ripple of water catching the light like a heartbeat. Alexander walked ahead, loosening his tie. His movements were slower tonight, less precise. Emily followed, unsure if she should stay near the door or step closer. Everything about this moment felt fragile, like standing on a frozen lake, hearing it begin to crack beneath you, but not wanting to move. "Would you like a drink?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost careful. "Sure," she said, her tone soft. "Something light." He poured 2 glasses of wine, handed her one, and leaned against the counter. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city lights flickered across his face, painting him in shifting gold and blue. "It's strange," he said finally. "I've had this view for years, and yet it feels different tonight." She looked toward the glass, her reflection mingling with his in the window. "Maybe it's because you're not looking at it alone." That made him smile, just a little. Maybe. They sat by the window, the city spread out below like a living thing. He told her, for the first time, about his father's passing, about how he'd built Reed Dynamics to prove something to his father, to himself, to the world. He spoke not like a CEO, but like a man remembering how heavy success can feel when there's no one left to share it with. Emily listened, her hands wrapped around the stem of her glass. "You've been carrying too much alone," she said softly. He turned to her. "It's easier that way." "Easier," she replied, "but not better." The truth of it hung in the air. He looked down, then laughed quietly, an unfamiliar, vulnerable sound. "You make it sound so simple." Maybe it is, she said, or maybe you've just forgotten what simple feels like. For a moment, the only sound was the soft rhythm of rain. He reached out, brushing his thumb along the edge of her sleeve. "You make me forget," he whispered. She met his gaze. The walls between them, years of discipline, distance, and unspoken fear, felt thinner now. One breath, two, and then, as if neither could stop it, the space between them disappeared. The kiss was different this time. No tension, no hesitation, just warmth deep and quiet, like the first break of dawn after a long winter. His hand found hers, fingers lacing together as if they'd done it 1,000 times before. The world outside fell away, the skyline, the rain, the endless hum of Manhattan. Inside, there was only the sound of their hearts and the faint rhythm of breath against skin. He had spent years controlling everything: time, power, emotion, but tonight he let go. He didn't lead, he didn't command, he simply was, and she saw him. Not the man in tailored suits, not the name carved on skyscrapers, but the human beneath it all. The man who still kept an old photo on his desk, face down. The man who carried silence like armor. When the city finally grew quiet, they lay side by the window, wrapped in the afterglow of something that didn't need to be named. The moonlight fell across them, silver and soft. Emily traced a line along his arm. "You know," she murmured, "I didn't think you were capable of letting go." He smiled faintly. "Neither did I." She laughed quietly. "How does it feel?" He thought for a long moment, like standing in the middle of the storm and realizing you're not drowning anymore. Outside, the rain had stopped. The river below shimmered under the faint glow of dawn. He turned his head toward her. There was something raw in his eyes, something she'd never seen before. "Emily," he said softly. He hesitated, then exhaled. "You make it hard to stay who I was." She smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." He closed his eyes, breathing in the quiet. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to plan the next step, to win, to control. He just felt human. The hours slipped by, unnoticed. The city began to wake, faint sounds of traffic rising from below. Emily sat up, wrapping herself in the sheet, watching the sky turn from dark blue to gold. He watched her from where he lay, the morning light catching her hair. "You should stay," he said quietly. She looked back at him. "You know we can't make this simple." "I know," he said, "but right now, I don't care." There was a long pause. Then she reached out, brushing his cheek with her fingertips. "You will," she whispered. "Tomorrow. When the world remembers who you are." He caught her hand, holding it against his face. "Maybe tomorrow," he said, "but not tonight." The moment lingered soft, aching, infinite. When she finally left, the sun had risen fully. The Hudson gleamed in the distance, light scattering across the water like pieces of glass. Alexander stood by the window, the room still carrying her warmth. The city was alive again. Emails, calls, the relentless rhythm of power waiting for him to return. But he didn't move. He stayed there, shirt unbuttoned, tie forgotten, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. The man looking back wasn't the glacier. Not anymore. Something inside him had shifted for good. And though the day ahead would pull him back into its noise, he knew the night had changed him in ways no rule, no title, no distance could undo. Somewhere between the rain and the dawn, the ice had melted, and for the first time in years, his heart quiet, trembling had begun to beat. The first light of dawn crept across the skyline, spilling soft gold over the Hudson. In the quiet of his penthouse, Alexander Reed stood barefoot by the window, shirt unbuttoned, coffee cooling in his hand. The city was waking sirens in the distance, the hum of early traffic rising like a heartbeat, but for once, he didn't feel the usual pull of the clock. The world could wait. He was still somewhere between the night and the morning, between control and surrender. The sheets behind him were still tangled, carrying the faint trace of her perfume, a memory, a warmth that hadn't yet faded. He smiled without realizing it, not a smirk, not the restrained half-curve that people in boardrooms mistook for approval. This was different, unguarded, almost boyish, a softness that had no place in the world he ruled. He caught his reflection in the glass and for a second didn't recognize the man looking back. The glacier was gone. By the time he arrived at Reed Dynamics, the city was in full motion. The revolving doors spun, heels clicked, screens flickered awake. The usual hum of efficiency filled the building, but when the elevator doors opened on the 35th floor, something unusual happened. Conversations faltered, heads turned, people noticed. Alexander Reed was smiling. Claire, his assistant, blinked twice, unsure if her coffee had betrayed her. "Good morning, sir," she said cautiously. "Morning, Claire," he replied, still smiling as he handed her his briefcase. She stared after him for a moment, whispering to another assistant once he passed. "Did you see that? He actually said, 'Good morning.'" "It's a trap," the other whispered back. "Don't fall for it." But it wasn't a trap. Not today. Inside his office, the air felt lighter somehow. The city stretched wide before him, bathed in morning light. He loosened his cuffs, set his phone down, and glanced at the clock. Emily would be in soon. He hadn't texted her. He hadn't needed to. There were things words couldn't carry without breaking something delicate, and last night was one of them. Still, he couldn't stop himself from checking the hallway every time footsteps passed. It wasn't nerves. It was something he didn't know how to name. Anticipation, maybe. Or the simple human ache of wanting to see someone again. When she finally walked in, the room changed. She was dressed in her usual crisp professionalism, navy blazer, neat hair, that quiet confidence that filled a space without demanding it. But there was something different in her eyes. Something that mirrored the shift in him. "Morning, Mr. Reed," she said, voice steady, but the faintest smile tugged at her lips. "Emily," he replied, and for a moment, the way he said her name felt like a secret only they shared. He gestured toward the table. "We have the board review at 10. Any updates on the audit?" She nodded, sliding a file toward him. "I finished cross-referencing the accounts. The irregularities connect back to one department. I'll need your clearance to dig deeper." He took the folder, but didn't open it right away. His gaze lingered on her, not as her boss, not as the CEO, but as the man who had watched the sunrise thinking of her laugh. "You did good work, Emily." Her eyes flickered up, surprised. Compliments from Alexander Reed were rare currency. "Thank you," she said softly. Their hands brushed as she handed him another sheet. And for a heartbeat, the office disappeared again. The noise, the hierarchy, the weight of rules, all of it faded. He pulled his hand back quickly, clearing his throat. "We'll continue after the meeting." "Yes, sir." She turned to leave, and as she did, the corner of her mouth curved into the faintest grin, just enough to let him know she'd felt it too. When the door closed behind her, Alexander sat back, exhaling a quiet laugh. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so unguarded. Everything about this morning, the city's hum, the coffee's warmth, the simple sound of her voice felt sharper, clearer, like the world had gained color overnight. For years, he'd lived in grayscale. Now, suddenly, there were shades of gold. Outside, Claire peeked into the office through the glass walls. The sight startled her again. Mr. Reed, leaning back in his chair, eyes not on his screens but somewhere distant. And yes, still smiling. She whispered to herself, "God help whoever did this to him." The day went by in quiet astonishment. Executives exchanged confused looks when Alexander thanked them during meetings. The board members whispered when he cracked a mild joke. The glacier had melted, and no one knew what to do with the water. But Alexander didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't performing. He wasn't protecting an image. He was simply existing, carrying a secret warmth no one could take from him. When evening came, the building emptied again, the sky outside burned orange and pink over the Hudson, and his office lights dimmed automatically. He sat there for a while, watching the sunset. The world felt slower, kinder. A soft knock broke his thoughts. "Come in," he said. Emily stepped inside, holding a new set of files. "I didn't want to leave without giving you these." He nodded, taking them, their fingers brushing again. The moment stretched small, dangerous, perfect. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked at him, eyes gentle. "You're different today." He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes this time. "Am I?" "Yes," she said. "It suits you." He leaned back, studying her for a moment. "You realize the office is probably writing conspiracy theories as we speak." She laughed softly. "Let them. Maybe they'll finally take a day off from gossiping about merger deadlines." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You make chaos sound peaceful." "Maybe peace just looks different when you stop fighting it," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was right there between them, unspoken, steady. When she left, he watched her walk down the hallway, the glass catching her reflection in 1,000 fragments. And for the first time, he wasn't thinking about risk or reputation. He was thinking about possibility. The sun dipped below the skyline, and the first stars began to appear. Alexander turned off the office lights and stood by the window, the city pulsing with life below him. It was strange how a single night could shift the weight of an entire lifetime, how one person's warmth could make the world feel less like a battlefield and more like a promise. He smiled again, softly, to no one in particular, somewhere, deep inside. The ice that once defined him had turned into something new, something that moved, that breathed. And though tomorrow would come with questions and consequences, tonight, he let himself believe in the quiet miracle of this morning, the first smile, the first hint that maybe, just maybe, he was learning how to live again. The days that followed felt like walking a line drawn too thin to see. Reed Dynamics ran as it always did, meetings, numbers, quiet efficiency, but beneath the surface. The air between them carried a pulse neither could ignore. Emily moved through the office with practiced calm, her heels steady on the polished floor, her expression composed. Yet every time she passed Alexander in the hallway, something flickered quick, hidden, undeniable. They didn't speak of that night. They didn't need to. The memory of it lingered in glances, in the brief brush of hands when exchanging files, in the stillness that followed when their eyes met longer than they should. At first, they tried to keep distance. He buried himself in work, longer hours, tighter focus. She kept her tone cool in meetings, her professionalism flawless. But the harder they tried to build walls, the more the cracks showed. It wasn't passion they couldn't control. It was the pull of recognition, of finally being seen. One Tuesday afternoon, the company buzzed with the sound of another quarterly review. Executives filled conference rooms, presentations flashing on wide screens. Emily stood near the back of the boardroom, taking notes as Alexander led the discussion. His voice was steady, the same calm authority that could fill a room and silence any doubt. But when his gaze found hers, just for a moment, the world seemed to pause. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Someone cleared their throat, a subtle reminder that the meeting hadn't ended. The spell broke. She dropped her eyes to her tablet, pretending to scroll, while he turned back to the charts, his words slightly slower now. Afterward, when the room emptied, she stayed behind to gather the leftover reports. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, the hum of conversation fading down the hall. "You missed one," a voice said. She looked up. He was standing near the door, hands in his pockets. "I thought you left," she said, her tone quiet. "I was going to." He took a few steps closer. "But then I saw you." There was a pause, the kind of pause that holds too much meaning. "This isn't a good idea," she murmured. "No," he agreed softly. "It isn't." He stopped just a few inches away. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker. She could hear the faint sound of rain beginning against the windows, the city beyond blurring into 1,000 gray lights. "Alexander," she said, his name barely a breath. He reached out, not to pull her close, but to touch her hand, just that. A simple, fleeting contact. But it was enough. The warmth shot through her, immediate and familiar, like the memory of fire on cold skin. She didn't move away, neither did he. It lasted only a second, a heartbeat. Then she pulled her hand back gently, her voice steady, but her eyes trembling. "People are watching." He nodded, jaw tight. Let them watch. But he didn't mean it, not really, because even in that moment, both knew what they risked. Reed Dynamics wasn't just a company. It was an empire built on perception, and rumors in a place like this spread faster than truth. By the next morning, the whispers had started. They began in the cafeteria, small, careless comments over coffee. "She's the auditor," right, one voice murmured. "I heard she's been spending late nights upstairs." Another laughed. "No one spends late nights with Reed unless they're trying to climb." By noon, the talk had moved to elevators, inboxes, private chats, nothing concrete, just speculation and tone. But in a world where image meant everything, even a rumor could wound. Emily felt the shift before she heard it, the way people paused when she walked by, the glances that turned too quickly away, the sudden politeness, sharp as glass. She said nothing. She smiled through meetings, answered questions with her usual composure, but each whispered word brushed against her like a cold wind. That evening, Alexander called her into his office. The blinds were half drawn, the light dim. He stood by the window again, looking out over the river, hands in his pockets. "I heard," he said quietly. "So did I." She replied. He turned, eyes dark with frustration. "They don't know what they're talking about." "No," she said, voice even, "but that won't stop them." He exhaled, the sound low and tired. "I can shut it down." "You can't," she said softly. "If you say anything, it only proves them right." He looked at her then, something raw flickering behind the calm. "Emily, I don't care what they think. You have to," she said, stepping closer. "You've built everything on how they see you, on control. If this gets out, if it turns into a headline, you'll lose more than your reputation." He fell silent. The truth of it pressed between them, heavy and cold. After a long pause, she reached for the stack of reports on his desk, her hand trembling just slightly. "We'll keep things professional," she said, "at least for now." He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "And when, for now, ends?" She looked up, meeting his gaze. "We'll know." The clock ticked softly. Outside, the rain had started again, harder this time. It filled the silence, steady and relentless. He watched her turn to leave, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Not regret, not yet, but something close. As she reached for the door, he said her name. Just once. She stopped, hand on the handle, waiting. His voice softened. "I never cared about rules until you." She turned slightly, her profile caught in the faint light. "Maybe that's why they exist," she said quietly, "to remind us what happens when we forget." Then she was gone. He stood there for a long time after, the rain streaking the windows, the city lights bending through the drops like fractured stars. The glacier had melted, yes, but now the world around him was beginning to notice, and nothing stays hidden forever when warmth meets cold. Still, as he stood there, a thought settled in his chest like an ember refusing to die. Whatever the world chose to believe, the truth between them was real. And for Alexander Reed, that truth was worth every risk. The morning the story broke, the city was still waking up. But inside Reed Dynamics, the storm had already begun. The company's name flashed across the news feeds, the words "CEO's secret relationship with employee" scrolling in bold across every screen. Cameras gathered outside the building. Phones buzzed endlessly. What had been whispers yesterday became headlines today. Alexander stood in his office, looking out at the sea of flashing lights below. He had faced boardroom battles, billion-dollar negotiations, and public scrutiny before. But this was different. This wasn't about business. It was personal. It was her, behind him. The door clicked open. Claire stepped in, her expression tight, voice low. The board's calling an emergency meeting in an hour. They want you there. He nodded once. Of course they do. She hesitated, then added quietly, They know Alexander? Everything. He didn't ask how. He didn't need to. Truth had a way of finding its way through cracks, especially the kind made by love. When she left, he turned from the window, the reflection of the city dissolving in the glass. On his desk, his phone vibrated again, messages, statements, damage control. He ignored them all. Instead, his eyes fell on the photo from long ago, the one of his father, his brother, the old shop in Boston. He picked it up, thumb brushing the dust from the frame. His father had once told him, the hardest decisions aren't the ones that cost money. They're the ones that cost your peace. He set the photo down and exhaled slowly. So be it, he murmured. At exactly 9. He walked into the boardroom. 12 faces turned toward him, some anxious, some angry, all waiting for him to speak. The air was sharp, heavy with judgment. At the end of the long table, Mr. Dalton, the oldest member of the board, adjusted his glasses. Alexander, he began carefully. You've built this company from the ground up. But this, he gestured toward the tablet in front of him, where the news headline glared, this compromises everything. We have investors asking questions, clients threatening to pull contracts. We need to contain this. Another voice followed, sharper. You've always said Reed Dynamics was about integrity. Now people are asking if that's still true. He listened, silent, steady. They spoke of reputation, perception, liability, words like breach, ethics, damage. But beneath it all, he heard what they weren't saying aloud. How could you fall? How could the glacier melt for someone beneath you? When they finally stopped, the room settled into uneasy quiet. Alexander rested his hands on the table, his voice calm but edged with steel. You're right about one thing. I built this company from the ground up, and I built it on truth. He looked around, meeting each gaze in turn. So, I'll give you the truth. He paused, the weight of his next words pressing through his chest. I'm not going to deny what's been said. Yes, Emily Carter and I are together. A ripple moved across the room. Shock, disbelief, irritation. Dalton's mouth fell open slightly. You're admitting it, I'm acknowledging it, Alexander said quietly, because it's not something I'm ashamed of. Someone at the far end spoke under their breath. You're risking everything. He nodded. Maybe, but I've spent my life controlling everything. My image, my choices, even my heart. And for what? To be untouchable, to be alone? He straightened, his tone low but firm. I love her, and I won't pretend I don't. Not to save face, not to protect numbers on a screen. The room went still. Through the glass wall, the city pulsed with morning light. The hum of traffic below was faint, distant. For once, Alexander didn't feel the weight of the skyscraper pressing in on him. He felt free. When the meeting ended, he stepped out into the hallway. The silence that followed him wasn't just about authority anymore. It was about audacity, about the rare sight of a man choosing something human over something perfect. Emily was waiting near his office, her expression tight, her hands clasped together. She had seen the headlines too. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly when he reached her. He shook his head. Yes, I did. Her eyes softened, but worry lingered there. They'll come after you for this. The press, the investors. He smiled faintly. They've come after me for less. I'll survive. She stepped closer, her voice almost a whisper. And what if I don't? He stopped. The question landed deeper than she meant it to. Emily, he said softly, you faced worse than gossip. You don't need my protection. Maybe not, she said, meeting his eyes. But I need the truth. Tell me this isn't going to ruin what you've built. He reached for her hand then, slow, deliberate. It might change what I've built, he said, but maybe it's time it changed. She looked down at their hands, the simple gesture grounding them amid the chaos. You really said it, in front of them. He nodded, every word. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she smiled small, fragile, but real. Then I guess I'm not just your employee anymore. He chuckled softly. You never were. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the world muted beyond the glass. Two people in a place built on rules, daring to live outside them. Later that evening, as they left the building together, the flashes of cameras exploded around them. Questions shouted through the air like bullets. Mr. Reed, is it true? Ms. Carter, were you involved before the audit? How long has this been going on? Alexander didn't slow down. He didn't look away. He simply tightened his hand around hers. At first, she hesitated, fear flickering across her face, but then she met his gaze, and the fear faded. Together. They walked through the chaos, past the noise, the lights, the judgment. In that moment, it didn't matter what the headlines said. What mattered was the warmth of his hand, the quiet certainty in his eyes. By the time they reached the car, the cameras had already turned the moment into spectacle. But to them, it was something else entirely, freedom disguised as defiance. Inside the car, as the driver pulled away, the city lights flickered across the glass. Emily leaned back, exhaling slowly. You know this changes everything, right? He looked at her, his voice low, steady. It already did. For a long time, neither spoke. The noise outside grew faint, fading into the hum of the road. Somewhere deep in the reflection of the skyline, Alexander caught a glimpse of himself again. Not the man they'd called the Glacier, not the CEO, just a man who had finally chosen to stop hiding. And beside him, Emily sat quietly, her hand still in his steady, brave, real. No matter what waited tomorrow, they had crossed the line together. And for the first time, Alexander Reed didn't feel like he was falling. He felt like he was finally standing where he belonged. The first sign of trouble came in silence. No warning, no explosion, just a subtle shift in the air, like the calm before a storm. It was a Thursday morning when the emails began to appear, anonymous, venomous, laced with just enough truth to sound believable. By noon, half the executive team had seen them. Screens lit up across departments with the same message, the same accusation. Emily Carter, insider for Vanguard Systems, the rival conglomerate. The name hit like ice water across the veins of Reed Dynamics. At first, Alexander didn't know. He was in a meeting downtown when Claire called, her voice shaking slightly despite her usual composure. You need to come back now. When he returned, the building didn't feel like his anymore. People looked up as he passed too quickly, too nervously. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A few pretended to check their phones. The whispering had changed flavor overnight. He found Emily in her office, standing near the glass wall, phone in hand. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, as though she'd just woken from a bad dream that refused to end. They're saying I leaked the merger documents, she said softly, not looking at him. He shut the door behind him, his jaw set. Who's saying that? She turned to him, voice trembling. Everyone. It's everywhere, news blogs, finance channels. There's even a photo of me having lunch with a contact from Vanguard last week. Alexander's eyes darkened. That lunch was part of your audit. I approved it myself. I know. Her voice broke slightly. But they don't care about that. He crossed the room, standing inches away. Emily, look at me. When she did, he saw the fear there, not of guilt, but of being powerless in the face of lies. He'd seen that look before in men and women, crushed by the weight of perception. It stirred something fierce inside him. "This isn't an investigation," he said, his tone low. "It's an attack, and I'll find out who started it." She shook her head. "You can't fix this. Alexander, not everything can be fought with strategy." He took a slow breath, trying to contain the fire rising in him. "Watch me." That afternoon, the company's crisis team assembled: legal, communications, security. The board demanded immediate answers. Screens filled the conference room with documents, photos, threads of digital evidence. Each new detail twisted the knife deeper. The emails had come from encrypted accounts. The photo had been altered subtle, but traceable to someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a narrative. Dalton, the same board member who had grilled Alexander days earlier, leaned forward. "You need to step back from this," he said sharply. "Let us handle the inquiry." Alexander's voice was calm, but it carried a dangerous edge. "You think I'll stand by while they destroy her? Your involvement could make it worse," Dalton insisted. "It already looks like favoritism." Favoritism. Alexander's hand hit the table, the sound echoing through the room. "They're framing an innocent woman, and you want me to worry about optics." The silence that followed was heavy, no one daring to meet his eyes. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice gentle. "Alex, maybe take a moment. You're not helping her by losing control." He closed his eyes, breathing hard. She was right. Anger was a weapon he knew too well, and one that often left scars. That night, he went home late, the city alive with storm clouds. The air was thick with the promise of rain. He poured a drink, but didn't touch it. Instead, he sat in the dark. The glow of his laptop, the only light. He traced the digital trail himself, line by line, hour by hour. The data didn't lie, even when people did. And somewhere past midnight, he found a hidden signature in the metadata of the altered image. Not random, not amateur, professional sabotage. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Got you," he whispered. The next morning, the world outside Reed Dynamics still hummed with speculation. Headlines called it the scandal that could sink a giant. Emily hadn't come in. Her desk sat empty, her screens dark. Some said she was suspended. Others said she had fled. Alexander walked through the lobby, past the cameras waiting to catch his expression, but his face was calm now. He'd found his center again. Inside the boardroom, he stood before them, all board members, advisors, reporters. "You want the truth," he said, his voice clear, steady. "You'll have it." He clicked the remote. Screens came alive with data time-stamped files, message headers, tracking codes. He spoke methodically, the precision of a surgeon dissecting a wound. Every detail, every trace, every connection pointed to the same place. "Vanguard systems," he said finally. "They fabricated the leak. They forged internal communications. And they used Emily Carter's name because they knew it would hurt me and this company." A murmur swept through the room. He continued, his tone like ice. "Emily Carter's access records show no anomalies. Every action she took was logged, approved, and reviewed. This was never about her being guilty. It was about making her look guilty." Dalton rubbed his temples. "We'll need to verify it's verified," Alexander said flatly. "I have our cybersecurity chief on record confirming it." At that moment, the doors opened. Emily stood there, pale but steady. The room turned. She looked at him, eyes wide, uncertain why he'd called her there. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice softening for the first time. "You have nothing to defend yourself against." He turned back to the board. "Because I stand with her." Then, to the cameras, to the watching world. He said the words that would echo beyond that day. "She's not a liability. She's the reason I still believe in integrity." You can quote that. The reporters froze, unsure if it was confession or declaration. But for Emily, standing at that doorway, it was something else entirely. It was protection. It was faith. After the meeting, when the hallways emptied and the noise died down, she found him alone by the window again, looking out at the storm finally breaking. Rain streaked the glass, heavy and relentless. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. He turned to her, eyes tired but unbroken. "Yes, I did. Because they came for you through me, and I won't let that stand." She stepped closer. "You can't fight the whole world. Alexander," he smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I can fight for you." Outside, thunder rolled across the skyline, deep and distant. Inside, he reached for her hand, not with the desperation of someone afraid to lose, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already chosen his side. For the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe. The storm outside raged on, but in that quiet office, something else took root, a steady, unshakable kind of peace. And though they both knew more battles would come, they also knew this, whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning of the hearing began in quiet gray. The storm that had battered the city had passed, leaving the streets damp and shining, the air cool and sharp. Inside read dynamics. The halls were strangely still, like a theater moments before the curtain rose. Everyone knew what the day meant, the company's future, their names, their truth. Emily arrived early. She wore no jewelry, no bright color, just a plain white blouse, dark slacks, and a single small silver watch. Her hair was tied back, her eyes steady. It wasn't armor, it was clarity. She had spent the night combing through data logs, code fragments, and encrypted trails, piecing together the story no one wanted to see. And now, she carried it all in one slim folder pressed against her chest, a truth that could either save or ruin everything. When Alexander saw her step out of the elevator, he felt something shift inside him. Not the usual surge of protectiveness or anger, but pride, quiet, deep, undeniable pride. "You didn't have to come," he said softly. "I did," she answered. "It's my fight too." He nodded, and for a moment just looked at her, the calm in her posture, the determination in her gaze. There was strength in her silence, and he knew then that whatever happened in that room, he wouldn't face it alone. The boardroom was full, lawyers, analysts, media representatives, they all waited like spectators at a trial. The long table gleamed under the white lights, and the hum of electronics filled the air. Alexander and Emily sat side by side. Across from them were the auditors from Vanguard Systems' legal team, 3 men in dark suits, their expressions carved from marble. The lead investigator began. "Mr. Reed, Miss Carter, thank you for joining. We've reviewed the initial findings you submitted, but before we proceed, we'd like to clarify the extent of your claims. You're accusing Vanguard Systems of deliberate corporate sabotage, correct?" Alexander didn't flinch, not accusing, proving. The man raised an eyebrow. "Then by all means, prove it." He gestured to Emily, and for the next 40 minutes, she spoke. Her voice never trembled. She explained the timestamps, the metadata, the subtle code injection that altered internal communications. She showed how a single IP registered under a shell company connected to Vanguard's private servers, every step backed by hard evidence, every claim wrapped in logic and precision. Even the board members, used to legal jargon and crisis briefings, found themselves listening not to a defense, but to a masterclass. Emily didn't sound like a woman trying to survive a scandal. She sounded like someone uncovering a truth long buried. At one point, she paused to catch her breath. Alexander leaned in slightly, his voice low enough only for her to hear. "You're brilliant." She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Remind me to put that in the official transcript." When she finished, silence filled the room. The evidence was undeniable. The Vanguard representatives exchanged uneasy glances, their composure cracking for the first time. Dalton, the elder board member who had once doubted them, leaned forward, his tone softer now. "Miss Carter, you've just saved us." Emily shook her head. "I didn't do it alone." He looked at Alexander, then back at her. "No, but you reminded us what this company was built on. Truth." The lead investigator cleared his throat, trying to regain ground. We'll need to authenticate these files. Of course. Alexander stood, his presence commanding but calm. You'll have every file, every log, every second of data we've traced. But make no mistake, this is over. And it was, within days. Vanguard's tactics were exposed. The press that had once fed on rumor now turned on the story, like wolves on fresh prey. Corporate giant falsifies leak. Reed Dynamics cleared of espionage scandal. The headlines rolled through the networks like waves washing away ash. But inside the company, the change ran deeper. People walked taller. The air felt lighter. And somewhere in that shift, Alexander and Emily found themselves standing at the center, not as scandal, but as proof of resilience. One evening, when the building had gone quiet again, they stood by the window in his office. The sun was setting, streaking the Hudson with ribbons of orange and rose gold. The glass reflected their faces. Two people who had been through fire and somehow come out softer, not harder. "You did it," he said quietly. She turned toward him. "We did." He smiled, a small, tired smile. "I don't think I've ever trusted anyone the way I trust you." She looked at him, her eyes warm, reflective. "Trust isn't something you have, Alexander. It's something you keep doing, every day." He thought about that, about how for years he'd lived by contracts and clauses, by rules designed to prevent loss. And yet, here she was, proof that real strength wasn't about control. It was about belief. He reached for her hand, not as the man who owned the building, but as the man who had almost lost himself inside it. "Then I'll keep doing it," he said softly. "Every day. Outside." The city lights flickered on, one by one, like stars coming alive. For a long while, they stood in silence, just the faint hum of the city below, the rhythm of traffic, the soft pulse of life moving forward. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, and he closed his eyes. The world had tried to break them apart with fear, with rumor, with lies. But somehow, it had done the opposite. It had taught them how to stand closer. He thought back to the first time he'd seen her, the new auditor with the sharp eyes and steady voice. He'd admired her then. Now, he understood her. The light outside shifted, fading slowly into twilight. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" He smiled. "Now, we breathe, and then we build again." Her hand tightened around his. "Together, always." As the city's reflection shimmered against the glass, the last of the day's light caught her face, soft, strong, alive. It wasn't the light of victory that filled the room that evening. It was something gentler, the kind of light that comes after a long night, when the world finally exhales, and two people realize they've already won just by surviving it together. The air smelled of turpentine and lavender when they stepped into the studio. Afternoon light poured through tall windows, casting streaks of gold across half-finished canvases and jars filled with brushes. Grace Reed barefoot, hair tied in a messy knot. Smudges of blue paint on her cheek turned when she heard them. "Well," she said with a grin, "if it isn't my brother, the famous workaholic. And this must be the woman who finally got him to take a weekend off." Emily laughed, instantly disarmed. "I'm afraid that's true." Alexander rolled his eyes, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Grace, please behave." His sister ignored him, crossing the room and pulling Emily into an impulsive hug. "I've heard so much about you," she said. Emily smiled softly. "I doubt that's true. He doesn't talk much." Grace leaned back, studying her with painter's eyes, curious. "Searching? He doesn't talk much, but he looks different when he says your name. That's how I knew." Alexander sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. This was a mistake. Grace laughed, the sound light, like glass bells. No, this was long overdue. She turned back to Emily. He needed someone to remind him that life isn't a quarterly report. Emily glanced at him, her eyes warm. "He's learning." Grace smiled knowingly. "Good. Keep teaching him." They spent the afternoon surrounded by the smell of oil paint and sunlight. Grace showed Emily her work, a series of abstract landscapes, all in deep blues and silvers. I paint what I can't say, she explained. Our father used to call it emotional math. Emily tilted her head. That's beautiful. Grace shrugged. It was his way of saying feelings can't always be solved, but they can be expressed. She looked at her brother. He forgot that for a while. Alexander met her gaze, but didn't argue. There were truths between siblings that didn't need words. Later, when Grace stepped out to wash her brushes, Emily wandered around the studio, stopping at a small canvas tucked in the corner. It was unfinished, but the strokes were careful, deliberate. The colors gray fading into soft gold looked like dawn. She was painting you, Alexander said quietly behind her. Emily turned. Me? He nodded. She's been painting this for months. She said it was a feeling she couldn't name. I think now she has a name for it. Emily smiled, eyes shimmering in the fading light. Maybe she was painting hope. That night, as they drove back to the city, the silence between them was comfortable, the kind that didn't need filling. Alexander reached for her hand as the skyline came into view, lights flickering like 1,000 tiny promises. Grace likes you, he said finally. I like her too. She's protective, he added. So am I, Emily said softly. He looked at her, and something in his chest tightened in a way that wasn't painful. It was grounding. For a man who'd lived by rules and structure, love was still the most unpredictable equation he'd ever faced. Days later, it was Emily's turn. The road to Vermont stretched long and green, winding through fields dotted with barns and apple trees. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and rain. As they turned onto the gravel driveway, a small farmhouse came into view, white siding, ivy curling up the porch posts, wind chimes swaying lazily in the breeze. Her mother, Martha Carter, stood on the porch waiting, gray hair tied neatly back, eyes sharp but kind, hands still stained from gardening. When Emily stepped out of the car, Martha's face softened into a smile. You made it. Of course, Emily said, hugging her tightly. I brought someone I want you to meet. Martha's gaze shifted to Alexander. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she extended her hand. Mr. Reed. I've read about you. He smiled politely. I hope not too much. Just enough to know you don't take weekends off, she said with a hint of humor. Emily laughed. That's becoming a theme. Martha's eyes softened. Well, any man who drives 6 hours to meet a woman's mother is already learning something. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and old books. A kettle whistled on the stove. Family photos lined the mantel. Emily at 5, with missing front teeth, her father smiling beside her. Alexander paused at the picture. He passed when I was 10, Emily said quietly beside him. Mom kept the house the way it was. He nodded, not speaking. Some griefs didn't need language. Over dinner, conversation flowed easily. Martha asked about his work, his sister, his late parents. Alexander answered honestly, sometimes awkwardly, but always sincerely. When he spoke of Grace, his eyes softened in a way that made Martha smile. After dessert, she led him to the porch. The night air was cool, the stars bright against the deep velvet sky. Emily's strong, Martha said, her voice gentle. But she's been alone for a long time. I can see she's different with you. Alexander looked down, fingers tightening on his coffee mug. She changed me before I even realized it. I used to think control was strength. Now, I think strength is trust. Martha studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then maybe you're the one I can trust with her heart. He met her eyes. You can. Inside. Emily watched them through the window, two people from different worlds, speaking quietly, finding understanding in the stillness. When he came back in, she smiled. So, did she interrogate you? He chuckled, only a little, and he stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I think she approves. She leaned into his touch. That's a first. He laughed softly. For both of us, later, When the house went quiet and the lights dimmed, they stood on the porch again, side by side. The field stretched endlessly under the moonlight, the air carrying the scent of hay and rain. She was right. You know, Emily said. About what? About trust. She looked up at him. It's not something you say. It's something you keep doing. He smiled faintly. You sound like someone I know. The wind stirred, soft and cool. In that moment, everything felt still the chaos of the city, the battles they'd fought, even the noise of who they had been. Here, surrounded by the quiet strength of family, it all fell away. He reached for her hand, and she didn't hesitate. Their fingers laced together easily, naturally, as if this home, simplicity, belonging had been waiting for them all along. As the stars shimmered above and the world around them exhaled, Alexander thought, maybe this is what peace feels like. And beside him, Emily whispered, almost to herself, we're going to be okay. He believed her. The desert wind carried a low hum, brushing through the canyons like an ancient song. The sun was beginning its slow descent, turning the Grand Canyon into a vast sea of gold and crimson. The air was dry, sharp, and full of silence, the kind of silence that holds everything you're afraid to say. Alexander and Emily stood at the edge of the overlook, just far enough from the crowd to feel alone. Below them, the canyon stretched endlessly, layer after layer of stone shaped by time, by wind, by patience. Emily's hair danced in the wind, strands catching the light like threads of fire. She laughed softly, her voice carried by the air. I still can't believe you got me out here. You, of all people, Mr. City Skyline. He smiled, hands in his jacket pockets. Even I need a horizon sometimes. She turned to look at him, a little amused. You, the man who doesn't leave his office without a reason. This, he said quietly, is my reason. For a long moment, neither spoke. The canyon glowed beneath them, its shadows deepening as the sun dipped lower. Emily closed her eyes, breathing it in. The scent of dust, the faint heat still rising from the rocks, the feeling of space so vast it made everything else seem small. When she opened them again, Alexander was watching her, not with the careful gaze of a CEO, but with the quiet awe of a man who finally understood what it meant to be still. You're thinking too much, she said with a smile. Maybe, he admitted, or maybe I'm just realizing how long it's been since I stopped thinking. The wind picked up, tugging at his coat. For a moment, he looked out across the canyon, its depth, its silence, its permanence. You know, he said softly, I've spent years building things that don't last. Companies rise, contracts expire, people move on. But this, he nodded toward the canyon, this has been here for millions of years, and somehow, it's still changing. Emily followed his gaze. Maybe that's what makes it beautiful. Change doesn't always destroy things. Sometimes it carves them into something better. He looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes, something steady, certain. He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath over the cool wind. You've changed me, Emily, more than you'll ever know. She smiled faintly, brushing a hand against his chest. That was never my goal. I know. He took her hand gently, his voice lowering. That's what makes it real. The sky was bleeding now, orange melting into rose, fading into violet. Shadows crawled up the canyon walls as the light fell softer, almost sacred. He took a deep breath, as if trying to memorize it, the sound of the wind, the color of the sky, the way her eyes reflected both. Emily, he began, and there was something different in the way he said her name this time. It wasn't habit, it was vow. She turned to him, sensing it before he spoke. He reached into his pocket, but his hand came out empty. No ring, no velvet box, just him, just truth. I don't have a ring, he said quietly. I didn't want this to be planned or perfect. I just wanted it to be real. Her eyes softened, her breath catching slightly. He stepped closer, holding her hands between his. The wind wrapped around them, carrying his words. You once told me that control isn't strength, that trust is. And for the first time in my life, I believe that. You've made me want to live honestly, to feel things I used to avoid, to build something that isn't measured in profit or power. He paused, his voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from honesty. You've made me want to live, for real. She blinked back tears that caught the last glint of sunlight. The canyon was quiet around them, as if the world itself had paused to listen. He smiled faintly. So, I guess what I'm asking is simple. Will you keep doing that? Will you keep making me live for a second? The words hung there, fragile and infinite. Emily's hand tightened in his. She didn't speak right away, her throat too full, her heart too loud. The sky behind him was burning now, a horizon of light and shadow, fire and gold. She laughed softly through her tears. That's your version of a proposal. He nodded once. That's all I've got. She smiled through the tears now, shaking her head gently. You don't need anything else. Then she whispered, voice trembling with joy. Yes. Alexander, yes. He closed his eyes for a second, as if taking in the word, the sound, the weight of it. Then he pulled her close. The wind swirled around them, warm and fierce, carrying their laughter into the open sky. There was no applause, no cameras, no diamond gleam, just two people standing at the edge of the world, finding something more eternal than stone. When he finally spoke again, his voice was soft. You didn't even hesitate. She leaned against his chest, smiling. I didn't have to. The sun dipped lower, and the canyon turned crimson, the kind of color you only see once in a lifetime. He brushed a thumb across her cheek, catching a tear. You know, he murmured, I never believed in forever. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. And now, he smiled. Now I believe in you. For a long while, they stood in silence. The kind that doesn't separate, it connects. The kind that says more than words could. As the last light faded, they turned to leave, fingers intertwined. The air was cooling, but neither felt it. Behind them, the canyon lay vast and eternal, holding their secret, their promise, their beginning. Emily looked back once, the wind brushing her hair across her face. You picked the perfect place, she said. He smiled, watching the horizon. No, he said quietly. You made it perfect. The sun slipped beneath the edge of the world, leaving the sky painted in soft afterglow. The canyon, carved by time and patience, stood as witness. And somewhere between earth and sky, between all that had been broken and all that had healed, two hearts made a promise that needed no proof, just wind and love. The sun hung low over the California hills, casting a soft amber glow over the vineyard. Rows of grapevines stretched toward the horizon, their leaves shimmering in the late afternoon light. Somewhere beyond the fields, the ocean murmured quietly against the cliffs, a steady rhythm beneath the laughter of guests and the distant hum of jazz guitars mixing with the warm twang of a country fiddle. It was the kind of day that didn't feel real, too perfect, too full, too still. Emily stood near the small wooden cottage where she had dressed that morning. Her gown was simple ivory silk that moved like light when she turned. No diamonds, no veil, just a wildflower tucked behind her ear and the scent of lavender in the air. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from awe. Through the open window, she could see guests gathering near the arbor, their voices a gentle hum against the wind. Grace was adjusting the microphone for the band, barefoot in the grass, her hair braided loosely over her shoulder. Martha was arranging small bouquets of baby's breath on each table, her eyes glowing with quiet pride. Emily smiled. Home, she thought. Somehow, all of this, the vineyard, the laughter, the people felt like home. Hey, came a soft voice behind her. It was Grace. You ready? Emily laughed softly. Not sure anyone ever is. Grace tilted her head, studying her with that familiar reed gaze. You know, I never thought I'd see the day my brother stood still long enough for something like this." Emily smiled, her eyes bright. "Neither did I." Grace reached out, squeezing her hand gently. "Thank you for finding him in all that noise." Emily's throat tightened. "He found me too." Outside, the music shifted. The crowd began to settle. The wind stirred, brushing against her dress like a whispered promise. Grace took a step back, smiling. "Go," she said softly. "He's waiting." The path to the arbor was narrow and lined with pale yellow petals that the children had scattered moments ago. The boards creaked under her heels, and somewhere, a bird sang above the vines. She looked up, and there he was. Alexander stood at the end of the aisle, dressed in a light gray suit that caught the sun, his tie undone just slightly, his hair tousled by the wind. He wasn't the glacier anymore. The man who had once been defined by control now looked open, human, radiant. When he saw her, he smiled, and for a heartbeat, the world went still. Emily took a breath. Each step felt lighter, as if the ground itself was carrying her forward. And when she finally reached him, he reached for her hand, his touch grounding her in the present, anchoring her against the rush of emotion that trembled behind her eyes. "You look," he began. His voice caught somewhere between wonder and disbelief. She smiled softly. "So do you." The officiant spoke a few words gentle, meaningful, but most of it blurred into the sound of wind, the rustle of leaves, and the quiet murmur of hearts recognizing something sacred. When it came time for their vows, Alexander took a long breath. The air around them shimmered with light. "I spent years thinking strength meant standing alone," he said, his voice low but clear. "That control could protect me from pain. And then you came, and everything I thought I knew fell apart. You didn't just change my life, Emily. You changed me. You taught me that love isn't weakness, it's the courage to be seen, even when it hurts. You are my choice, every day, in every way." Emily blinked, a tear tracing a slow path down her cheek. She smiled through it, her voice trembling but steady. "I used to believe love had to be safe," she said. "Predictable. Something you could count and measure, but you taught me it can also be wild and deep and terrifying and still right. I've never met someone who made me feel so free and so understood at the same time. You are my home, Alexander Reed, and I promise to love you when it's easy, and when it's not, when the world cheers, and when it turns quiet, I'll be there." There was no music yet, no cue, just silence and the soft cry of a seagull somewhere over the hills. Then the officiant smiled gently. "You may kiss the bride." He didn't hesitate. It wasn't a kiss for the cameras or the guests. It was soft, deliberate, full of everything they hadn't been able to say in words. The crowd cheered, the band struck up a blend of violin and saxophone, and laughter rippled through the vineyard like sunlight over water. Grace whooped from the sidelines. Martha wiped a tear and clapped her hands together, beaming. The party unfolded beneath strings of warm lights that swayed gently as the evening wind picked up. The tables were draped in linen, dotted with jars of wildflowers and flickering candles. Jazz melted into country, laughter into dancing. Emily kicked off her shoes first, spinning barefoot in the grass as the band shifted to an old tune that made even the waiters smile. Alexander joined her reluctantly at first, then gave in completely, letting her pull him close, his laughter quiet but unguarded. "You're terrible at this," she teased. He grinned. "Then I'll just have to keep practicing with you." They danced until the stars began to appear. The vineyard glowed gold and silver under the lights. When the song slowed, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't remember the last time I felt this alive," he whispered. "Then don't forget it," she said. He smiled. "Never. Later." They stood at the edge of the field, looking out where the vines met the dark line of the forest. The air was cool now, the kind that smells of earth and promise. Behind them, their families laughed, glasses clinked, music floated into the night. In front of them, the world was wide open. He took her hand again, fingers fitting perfectly between hers. "You realize," he said softly. "This is the part where most people say it's the end." She leaned into him, her voice gentle. "Then they've never loved like this." He kissed her temple, a quiet smile curving his lips. "Two worlds," he murmured, and somehow they fit. Emily looked up at the sky, where the stars had begun to scatter across the dark. Maybe they were always meant to. The wind carried their laughter into the night, through the vines, toward the ocean, somewhere beyond the hills. A wave broke against the rocks, a soft applause from the earth itself, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Two worlds, once so far apart, had found their place together under one golden sky. The sea was calm that morning, a soft gray blue stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The waves brushed against the rocky shore with a steady rhythm, the kind of sound that fills silence without breaking it. The cottage they rented sat on a quiet stretch of the Maine coast, tucked between the pines and the sea-wooden, simple and full of light. Emily stood barefoot on the porch, a mug of coffee in her hands. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of salt and pine sap. A few gulls wheeled lazily above the water, behind her. She could hear Alexander moving around the kitchen, clinking dishes, humming softly under his breath. It was strange, she thought, how quickly peace could feel natural, how the noise of the world, the meetings, the headlines, the endless demands had faded to nothing against the sound of the tide. Alexander stepped out, carrying his own mug. His hair was still damp from the shower, his white shirt rolled up at the sleeves. He looked different here, softer, freer. "You're up early," he said, joining her by the railing. "So are you." He smiled faintly. "Old habits die hard. New ones are better," she said. He glanced at her, eyes warm. This one might last. For a while, they didn't talk. They didn't need to. The sea spoke for them, the hush and rise of water against stone, the distant call of a boat engine somewhere down the coast. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I used to think mornings were for strategy. Now I think they're for breathing." She looked at him, smiling softly. "And for pancakes." He laughed, a deep, easy sound that seemed to blend with the wind. "I can handle breathing. Pancakes might be pushing it. I'll teach you," she said. He turned toward her then, a look of amusement and tenderness mixed together. "You've already taught me enough." "Maybe," she said, "but you're a good student." He reached out, brushing his thumb over her cheek. The gesture was small, familiar, and full of gratitude. The day unfolded slowly. They walked the narrow path along the cliffs, where wild grass brushed their legs and the ocean wind tugged at their clothes. Alexander carried a small backpack with sandwiches and a bottle of wine, his idea of adventure. Every so often, Emily stopped to pick up smooth pebbles from the sand, turning them in her palm like small secrets. "You're collecting the whole beach," he teased. "Memories," she said. "They fit better in your pocket than photographs." He smiled. "Then I'll carry the wine. You carry the world." They found a quiet spot overlooking the water and sat down. The sun was climbing higher now, turning the waves silver. The bottle of wine sat between them, half empty, forgotten for the moment. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "The noise, the meetings, the chase." He thought for a long time before answering. "I miss believing it mattered." She nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "And now," he said, "I know what does." A soft silence fell between them, the kind of silence that feels like understanding. He looked at her, and the weight of years, the ambition, the loneliness, the armor seemed to dissolve. "You know," he said quietly, "when people called me the glacier, I thought it meant strength, but it really meant I'd stopped feeling." Emily reached for his hand, and now, he smiled, squeezing her fingers. "Now, I melt too easily." She laughed, her head falling against his shoulder. "That's not a bad thing." "No," he said softly. "It's not. The afternoon light turned golden. The sea shimmered as if reflecting something they couldn't see but could both feel. They spoke about small things, about maybe getting a dog, or planting a garden, or finding a house with a big porch where mornings like this could last forever. He surprised himself by how easily the words came. Plans without deadlines, dreams without agendas. "I don't need much," he said after a while. "Just you, some quiet, and maybe a porch swing. Add coffee," she said. He smiled. Always. When the sun began to sink, they walked back to the cottage. The sky had turned the color of honey and fire. Inside, she cooked while he set the table, clumsy but trying. The lights were soft, the air warm. Over dinner, she teased him about his terrible handwriting on the grocery list. He told her she still left her shoes in the hallway. Small imperfections, shared laughter. It felt like life, real and ordinary and irreplaceable. Afterward, they sat by the window, watching the last traces of daylight fade over the sea. The horizon was quiet now, a single line of silver separating sky from water. Emily leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're different here." He looked down at her. "How so? Your eyes don't look tired anymore." He smiled softly. "Maybe it's because I finally stopped running." From what he hesitated, then said, "From myself." She took his hand, tracing small circles against his skin. "You don't have to run anymore. I know," he said, "because you're here, outside." The waves kept coming steady, gentle, eternal. The wind moved through the pine trees, whispering at the edges of the night. When he spoke again, his tone was full of quiet certainty. "You know, there's something about this place. It makes time slow down." Emily nodded. "That's what love does." He turned toward her, eyes catching the faint glow of the lamp. "I never thought I'd deserve this." She smiled. "You don't earn peace, Alexander. You allow it. For a long time." They sat without speaking. The clock ticked softly. The world outside turned dark and calm. And in that stillness, something settled in him, not excitement, not ambition, but contentment. The rare kind that feels like truth. Later that night, after the lights were off and the sea sang them toward sleep, Emily whispered into the darkness, "What are you thinking?" He smiled in the quiet. "That this is what forever feels like." Her fingers brushed his. "Then let's stay here a little longer." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The waves did it for him, steady, patient, and full of promise. The glacier was gone. Only a man remained, a man who had finally learned how to love. The morning air was cool and clean, the kind that carried the faint scent of pine and sea salt. The horizon glowed softly, a thin line of gold cutting through the gray blue of dawn. The cottage stood quiet, wrapped in the hush of early light. Emily sat on the porch steps, knees tucked beneath her, a blanket draped loosely around her shoulders. A mug of coffee warmed her hands. Steam curled into the air, vanishing like whispers. Inside, she could hear Alexander moving slowly, deliberately, the sound of someone unhurried for the first time in his life. She smiled to herself. When he stepped out, the light touched him first, barefoot, wearing a soft flannel shirt. He looked younger somehow, or maybe just lighter, like someone who had finally set down the weight he'd been carrying for years. He sat beside her without a word. For a long while, they simply watched the horizon as it grew brighter, the sun lifting itself over the edge of the sea. The world seemed reborn in that moment, silent, golden, infinite. "I didn't think mornings could feel like this," he said finally, his voice still husky from sleep. Like what he thought for a second. Like peace. She smiled faintly, eyes still on the sunrise. "Maybe peace isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you stop running from." He looked at her then, the light catching in her hair, and nodded slowly. "You always make things sound simple." "They are," she said softly, "when you stop trying to control them." He chuckled under his breath, a quiet sound that came from deep within. "That's a lesson I should have learned years ago. Maybe you needed the winters first, she said. So, you'd know how much warmth means. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of gratitude, of understanding, of everything they no longer needed to say. The tide whispered below the cliffs, steady as breath. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, lonely and beautiful. Alexander leaned back against the porch railing, his gaze lost somewhere between the sky and the water. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "how different things might have been if we hadn't met?" Emily turned to him, her voice soft but sure. "I don't think about what didn't happen. I just thank God for what did." He reached for her hand then, his fingers brushing hers like the start of a promise. "You saved me," he said. She shook her head gently. "No, Alexander, you saved yourself. I just reminded you how—" He smiled, the kind of smile that lived in his eyes before it reached his lips. The light shifted as the sun rose higher. Shadows fell away from the trees. The grass gleamed wet with dew. Every color seemed sharper, more alive, the world seen through the eyes of someone who had almost lost it. She rested her head against his shoulder. "So, what happens now?" He exhaled slowly, as if the answer had been waiting for this moment. "Now we build." A company, she teased. He laughed softly. "No, a life." They sat like that for a while, listening to the rhythm of waves against stone. He thought about all the mornings he'd missed, the years spent chasing things that couldn't hold him, the nights spent alone in rooms filled with glass and light, but no warmth. He thought about the man he had been, cold, calculating, convinced that emotions were flaws to be managed. And then he thought of her, how she'd looked at him without fear, how she'd refused to bow to his walls, how she'd made him feel seen. The glacier had melted not in a storm, but in sunlight. He turned to her, his voice quiet. "Do you ever miss the city sometimes?" she said, smiling. "But it's like missing an old version of yourself. You remember it fondly, but you don't want to go back." He nodded. "I think I know what you mean." A moment passed. Then Emily whispered, almost to herself, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "What is this?" she said, gesturing to the world around them, the light, the sea, the quiet, everything after the noise. He followed her gaze. The sky was wide and endless, the kind of morning that felt like forgiveness. He squeezed her hand. "Everything after the noise," he repeated softly. "That's a good name for a book. Maybe someday," she said. He smiled. "Maybe someday." A light breeze brushed across the porch, carrying the smell of salt and pine. The coffee in their cups had gone cold, but neither cared. The sun climbed higher, flooding the world in gold. The light touched the windows, the trees, the sea, then, finally them. Emily lifted her face toward it, eyes closed, a small smile playing on her lips. Alexander watched her, a thought blooming quietly in his chest. This is what love looks like when it's real, not fireworks or chaos, but stillness, the kind that holds you steady when the rest of the world spins. He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You know," he murmured, "when I met you, I thought you were chaos." She opened her eyes, smiling, and now he leaned closer, whispering, "Now I know you were light." She didn't answer. She just leaned in and kissed him softly, the morning sun warm on their faces. For a long time after, they stayed there, two figures on a wooden porch, framed by the glow of dawn, wrapped in the quiet certainty of love that had been tested and found true. The world moved gently around them, the waves, the wind, the awakening day. But inside that stillness, time seemed to pause. Emily set her mug down, her voice barely a whisper. "Promise me one thing, anything. When life gets loud again, don't forget this sound." He tilted his head. "What sound?" She smiled. "The sound of peace." He looked out at the horizon, listening the waves, the birds, the slow, quiet hum of the morning, and nodded. "I won't forget." She rested her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the sun lift fully into the sky, bathing everything in warmth. And as the light spilled over them, soft and endless, a single thought echoed in both their hearts, wordless, but clear. When the heart melts, power loses its meaning. All that remains is love, the only thing strong enough to warm even the longest winter of a life. The sea kept whispering, the light kept growing, and somewhere in that gentle morning, two souls finally came home. Sometimes, life teaches us through the quiet moments, the ones that arrive after the storms have passed. Alexander and Emily's story isn't just about love between two people. It's about the courage to soften, to let go of the armor we build around our hearts. Many of us spend years chasing success, approval, or control, only to realize that peace doesn't live there. It lives in gentleness, in the sound of another heartbeat beside ours, in the mornings when we no longer need to prove anything. For those who have weathered many seasons of life, this story is a reminder that it's never too late to begin again, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of truth and tenderness. Love, at its purest, isn't about perfection or power. It's about presence, the willingness to stay, to listen, to forgive. When the heart finally melts, it doesn't lose strength, it discovers it. And in that discovery, we remember that the greatest victories in life are not the ones we win in the world, but the ones we win within ourselves, when we choose kindness over pride and connection over control. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your precious time listening to this story. If it touched your heart or reminded you of something true in your own life, we'd love for you to share that light forward. Please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories so you won't miss the next tale of hope, kindness, and the quiet beauty in everyday life. Your support helps these stories continue to reach hearts that need a little warmth. Until next time, stay gentle, stay inspired, and keep believing in love.